This webinar is originating from the City of Vancouver, which is founded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Hello, my name is Sophie King. I'm the Professional Learning and Events Coordinator with PIBC, and welcome to webinar number 6, Youth Engagement and Climate Action in celebration of National Indigenous Peoples Day, which is actually on June 17th this year. This webinar is generously sponsored by the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia, so thank you to REF BC and to Stephanie Butler for making this happen. Our keynote presenter today is Sarah Gillett. Let me just scroll forward here. Sarah Gillett, Senior Engagement Specialist with MODUS Planning, Design, and Engagement. Sarah will share her insight on how planners can effectively engage Indigenous youth on the topics of climate action and environmental issues that are of concern to them and their community. Welcome, Sarah. I'm also very pleased to welcome Cheyenne Bradley, a Kwantlen First Nations youth from Whitehorse, Yukon, and Sierra Tasi-Baker, a First Nations youth of Squamish, Musqueam, Kwakwaka'wakw, Tlingit, Haida, and Hungarian heritage from North Vancouver. And I'm very proud of both these young women, given how much they've accomplished in a short amount of time, and we are very honored to have them both present for us today. So welcome, Cheyenne, and welcome, Sierra. And now we will begin the presentation. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please type them in the chat window located to the lower right-hand corner of your screen, and we will try to address as many questions as we can at the end of all the presentations. So now I will ask Sarah to please turn on your microphone and your webcam to begin your presentation.
Hi, hello.
Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophie, for the introduction, and for PIBC for putting forward this topic, and for all of you for joining us today. So my name is Sarah Gillett. I was born and now live in the unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Specifically, I grew up near the mouth of the Capilano River, named after Chief Joe Capilano, a Squamish Nation leader and icon. I'm a settler of mixed French and English descent. My parents both immigrated to Canada, my father from England as a child, and my mother from France in the 70s. I grew up very close to the Squamish Nation Capilano Reserve, but spent most of my youth completely disconnected from my Indigenous neighbors and the Indigenous history of the place where I lived. And like many Canadians, only started much later. For me, it was in university, to get exposed to Canada's history with Indigenous people, and I've been on a long journey of trying to catch up ever since. So I'm a planner and I'm an engagement specialist, and I got into community planning with a passion for youth engagement and youth activism from my years working for Canada's youth leadership program, Keynote. And it was my interest in youth leadership and its role in community building, which drew me to planning school. Coming out of school, I worked with Jeff Cook at Beringia Community Planning and had the honor of spending 8 years working directly with Indigenous communities across Canada on community-driven planning projects, whether those be comprehensive community plans, land use plans, health plans, or others. I am very grateful to the community members I've met across BC, the Yukon, and Ontario working on community-driven planning processes, and my engagement practice has really been shaped by the lessons that I've learned in that context. So it's because of that experience that I've been invited to start us off today. I must say I do so feeling a bit like an imposter. I am not Indigenous. I am sadly no longer considered a youth. Yet, the events of the world recently have reminded me that as a settler, as a planner, I have a lifelong responsibility to educate myself, to share what I'm learning, to push my colleagues and our institutions to consider the colonial roots of our chosen profession and how they've contributed to systems of injustice that continue to impact the lives of Indigenous people in Canada. So I'm going to share some of the things I've been learning on my reconciliation journey, and I've included in my presentation some references and books to allow you to dig deeper on any of the topics that I've brought up today. So earlier this month, City of Vancouver Reconciliation Planner Rena Sutar presented to the Parks Board a decolonization strategy, and I was really drawn to the functional definition of reconciliation that she shared. Understanding who we are on this land, positioning ourselves in relation to Indigenous rights holders, and being intentional about who we are being. So I've used this definition to structure my presentation today, where I'm going to explore specifically our role as planners in working with Indigenous youth in climate change planning, our relationship to Indigenous youth as we take on this work as planners, and specific approaches and strategies when intentionally working with Indigenous youth. So first, understanding who we are on this land, both as individuals and as institutions. I tried to give you a bit of a taste of my relationship to this land as a settler in my introduction. The other part of my identity is my studies and my chosen occupation, which of course has strong colonial roots and an emphasis in linear problem solving. And this shapes the way I see the world and I approach my work. Now moving beyond the individual to the profession of planning, I want to set the stage by acknowledging the long and deep traditions of Indigenous land use planning since time immemorial, and the Indigenous planners working hard in their communities to develop community-driven plans and implementing those plans on the ground in communities. I want to acknowledge the Indigenous scholars writing about the field of Indigenous planning and design and working with academic institutions to bring these perspectives forward. I want to acknowledge the Indigenous planners everywhere working within institutions and grappling with how to decolonize those institutions and their practices. And then I want to acknowledge the role that colonial planning has played in Canada in upholding racially discriminatory spatial policies and the resulting social injustice for Indigenous people. So there's enough for a whole other webinar on this topic, and I don't want to dwell here, but I want to highlight a few examples of what I mean by this. So planning has contributed to the erasure of Indigenous people through mapping and place naming, the dispossession of land and dislocation of Indigenous people in the name of city building and resource development. Without getting into on-reserve housing, outside of reserve, Indigenous people have faced racist housing policies such as redlining or racist covenants that have impacted where Indigenous people have settled and the quality of the built environment they live in and the corresponding health impacts. And finally, the long history of deliberate lack of representation of Indigenous people in public processes, going back to the denial of the right to vote, the right to leave reserve, or the right to seek legal representation. So understanding this history is key to understanding who we are as planners in moving forward and ensuring equitable outcomes for Indigenous people. So next, positioning ourselves in relation to Indigenous rights holders. So in preparation for hearing from our speakers today, I want to invite us to consider, how are we positioning ourselves in relation to Indigenous youth at the front lines of climate change action? So as I mentioned, I spent the first part of my planning education focused on this question of youth engagement in community planning. And one of the barriers that I uncovered to youth engagement really lies in our perception of youth. We can perceive youth to be vulnerable. We can perceive them to be citizens in training without the knowledge or expertise to lead, yet as something to protect, not to involve. So at the time I was in school, there was a lot of literature exploring the barriers to youth engagement. It basically boils down to lack of trust in their abilities from adults and lack of real power in affecting decision making. This visual on the right aims to illustrate that there's a spectrum of how youth can be involved in public policy. So at the bottom of this ladder, we have non-participation, which includes youth being manipulated, used as decoration, or tokenized. Then moving up, we've got youth being informed, being consulted, and close to the top, sharing decision-making with adults and initiating action. So this ladder is a helpful tool to prompt the question, when planning to engage youth, ask yourself, where do you want to be on this ladder? Now I want to turn to our relationship with Indigenous people. How do we position ourselves as planners to Indigenous climate activists? We can position Indigenous people as something to protect, a problem that needs to be solved. We can position Indigenous people as a barrier to moving forward, that thing that you're working on or trying to do, a hurdle to get over. The settler-Indigenous relationship, rooted in Indigenous people being a problem to solve, is deeply problematic and at the root of the systemic differences we are living in Canada. But how does our approach change when we position ourselves in relation to Indigenous people as rights holder? Indigenous youth as rights holders? How does this fundamentally shift the way we are in relationship, the opportunities for engagement and working together in a good way? So why is engaging Indigenous youth, specifically in climate action, so important? Well, demographics alone are reason enough. Close to half of all Indigenous people in Canada are under the age of 25, and the Indigenous population is growing at a rate 4 times faster than the rest of Canada. Globally, Indigenous communities contribute the least to climate change, yet are the first to experience the effects of it. I'd like to share a quote from Sheila Watt-Cloutier, Canadian Inuit climate activist and officer of the Order of Canada. "The glaciers are melting, and the permafrost is melting. There are new species of birds and fish and insects showing up. The Arctic is a barometer for the health of the world. If you want to know how healthy the world is, come to the Arctic and feel its pulse." Engaging Indigenous youth in climate change planning isn't a nice gesture or a feel-good story. Planning for climate change without addressing Indigenous rights and climate justice is simply not an option. Current and former colleagues at MODUS have introduced me to this idea of the seldom heard as an alternative to talking about hard-to-reach populations. Seldom heard is used to talk about audiences that are often underrepresented in planning processes, but using seldom heard rather than hard to reach acknowledges that no one is truly hard to reach if you're being intentional. The term seldom heard acknowledges that systemic barriers have contributed to certain groups being less often represented in decision-making processes. So both youth and Indigenous people are what in the engagement world get generally categorized as the seldom heard. Another thing that Rena said in her recent Parks Board presentation that really stuck with me is the observation that when a crisis hits, it has a way of stripping back the extras and revealing our priorities. Engaging youth and Indigenous people is often seen as an extra or a nice to have rather than a central piece of moving a process forward. And thus, Indigenous youth face both the barrier of being youth and being Indigenous as they try to have their rights recognized and fight for a seat at decision-making tables. Despite these barriers, so many Indigenous youth are rocking it at the front of climate change movements, of Indigenous rights movements, of planning processes, all while fighting for climate change action and Indigenous rights. They're facing legislation such as Bill 1 in Alberta, outlawing protests and disruptions to critical infrastructure, which really has the potential to aggravate existing tensions between police and Indigenous people. So as we consider young Indigenous climate change leaders, I want to caution us against getting stuck on hard to reach or vulnerable or citizens in training, but rather focus on what is lost when the voices of Indigenous youth are not at the table. So we started with understanding who we are on this land and as individuals and as institutions. And next we covered positioning ourselves in relation to Indigenous rights holders. So now I want to shift to being intentional about who we are being. So I believe that the profession of planning has a unique role to play in reconciliation. As planners, we have the power to bring various perspectives together to help communities articulate a vision for the future. And as we design planning processes, we have the power to decide who gets heard. So to support us in this work, I want to end by sharing a few lessons from my experience working with Indigenous youth and share some considerations and strategies on how to intentionally work with Indigenous youth on community planning and climate change projects. As with most demographic categorizations, youth, not a homogeneous group. Within this bucket of youth, we have children. And within that bucket, we've got young children, middle years children, teenagers, and young adults, and all of who can be engaged creatively in climate planning conversations. We have youth new to climate change action and youth already leading the way. So consider the different streams of engagement that are needed to target and mobilize those different audiences, and think about opportunities for older youth to mentor younger youth as you go. Indigenous people are not a homogeneous group. So let alone the rich diversity of languages, governance systems, protocols, planning approaches between the different Indigenous cultural groups in Canada, Indigenous identity often straddles different cultures, races, ethnicities, such as Afro-Indigenous youth, for example. What are the other identities that Indigenous youth straddle? For example, how do the perspectives of the Indigenous queer or the Two-Spirit youth differ? And lastly, climate change manifests in different ways. So our speakers will showcase just a couple of ways Indigenous youth are present in climate action. This includes Indigenous youth who are out on the land, living and monitoring the impacts of climate change. This includes youth living in rural communities, working with community members to identify and implement climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. This includes Indigenous youth working as professionals on climate change action in the city or on the front lines of climate activism and land defense. Think about the distinct roles for each in processes. So now, keeping all that diversity in mind, let's talk about strategies for effectively engaging Indigenous youth. So I invite you to consider the connection of youth to elders and the importance of that, and how through planning and engagement we can build opportunities for intergenerational sharing. Some of the most inspirational youth engagement projects I've had the honor of participating in have involved some elements of elder-youth connection, whether it's events that deliberately bring elders and youth together, or having an elder serve as a witness to a project that is being youth-led. Whenever possible, pay Indigenous youth for their time and knowledge. They are content experts and should be treated as such. Empower youth with real responsibility, especially when working within Indigenous communities. If you put youth in charge of engagement, they will make it fun, they will be listened to, and they will get people involved in a way that no outsider will ever be able to do. Especially within the comprehensive community planning movement in BC, I've had the honor of meeting exceptional youth, driving engagement processes, and courageously leading community conversations. And lastly, mentorship. So broadly, I invite us to consider what opportunities exist to support Indigenous youth participation in the jobs linked to climate action and climate solutions. And then thinking specifically about our profession, how can we ensure we are mentoring and creating opportunities for young Indigenous planners and designers whose perspectives will shape our profession? Or perhaps a better question is, how will Indigenous youth mentor us as we navigate the ways in which we can work more effectively together? I, for one, am very grateful to the Indigenous youth who have mentored me and continue to shape my practice. So at the moment, I'm keenly aware that I'm the only person between you learning directly from some of those Indigenous youth. So thank you again for being here today. I look forward to your questions, and I will now pass things on to Cheyenne Bradley from the Kwanlin First Nation.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation and for sharing your story with us. Yes, Cheyenne, please turn on your microphone and your webcam to begin your presentation. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Cheyenne.
Hi.
Hi, you sound good.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. My name's Cheyenne Bradley. I live up in Yukon. I'll introduce myself a little bit later, but I just wanted to give everybody a big thank you for letting me speak on this topic, the decline of salmon, because it's just something that's really near and dear to my heart and something that's really affecting my community and pretty much most communities in Yukon. So a little bit about myself. Like I said, my name's Cheyenne Bradley. I live in Whitehorse, Yukon, and I'm a member of the Kwanlin First Nation. I completed my Bachelor of Science degree last year in Northern Environmental and Conservation Science from the University of Alberta, but this was a partner program through Yukon College, which is now Yukon University. So I actually got to stay home for all of my studies. Then in 2018, I got a job for the summer with Department of Fisheries and Oceans, but while I was off of school. And then since then, I knew that working in the field of salmon was what I wanted to do for possibly the rest of my life. You can see in the picture here, this is a picture of myself releasing Chinook fry on one of our projects. So a little bit about my community. Kwanlin First Nation, the original people of Kwanlin they were called Tagish Kwan. Kwanlin is actually a Southern Shoshone word for water running through the canyon, and the reason why they picked that name is because the original people used to live along the rivers and through Miles Canyon, so that's where they kind of got that name from. Kwanlin traditional territory encompasses the city of Whitehorse, so we are pretty much located in and around the city of Whitehorse, and we also share our traditional territory with Ta'an Council. Just to give you an idea about how large Kwanlin traditional territory is, we have over 1,000 kilometers of settlement land, and we are one of the largest landowners in the city of Whitehorse. About 400 kilometers squared is within the city of Whitehorse. About 75% of the Yukon's population actually lives in Whitehorse, and then communities around. And our main language is Southern Shoshone. And in this picture you can see is the map of the Yukon, and kind of down towards the border there is where Kwanlin and Ta'an are. So I just wanted to give a brief background of what kind of species of salmon in the Yukon that we have. So we have 5 species, the main one being Chinook salmon. Most people call them king salmon, but we have chum, coho, salmon, kokanee, and sockeye. And this is a picture of my brother here actually at his partner's family fish camp. So I just wanted to put this in here and just to show how big the salmon can get. So why am I talking about this today? Why is salmon important to my First Nation? Well, in KDFN, we identify as salmon people. For generations, we've lived along the Yukon River and Miles Canyon, which you can see in the photo here. This is Miles Canyon. You can see the rapids and everything, but that was where the fish used to go through, and there would be fish camps all along the canyon there. Before we were actually displaced from that area. We're also known for our strong connection to salmon from the fish camp. So every year people would get together and fish for salmon and teach and get together families, etc. And salmon was seen as a valuable resource. It was seen such as a valuable resource that it actually is in our final agreements of what we want to do for salmon and what we want to achieve. Our elders, if you talk to our elders, they actually say that the waters used to run red with salmon and the river was just full of fish camps. But of course, that's not the case today, and I'll talk about that a little later. And of course, the nutritional value of salmon and other traditional foods. Our elders, because we don't have as much salmon and everything, they rely on our traditional foods such as salmon. So not eating them can actually cause things like diabetes, cancers, and other health risks. Why is salmon important to me as an Indigenous youth? As an Indigenous youth, I think it's really sad, and it kind of gets to me almost a lot actually, that I may never be able to catch a Chinook salmon for subsistence use in my own traditional territory. It was on my bucket list, and then until I found out about the numbers, and then it's hard to think that I may never be able to check that one off. Also, to hear about our elders talk about how the waters used to run red with salmon, and now we barely have any salmon coming back to the Yukon. It's really disheartening. Like, for example, we haven't had fish camps in a long time, and we actually have to rely on Alaska and Taku River Tlingit to get our salmon. They fly them in. So would we rather fish them our own? Most likely, yes. You know, and I want our people to be able to harvest salmon, not just as a sustainable number, but as an abundance, how it used to be, so that we never really have to think about, you know, are we going to be depleting them or anything like that. Another thing is, it's for me, it's hard to see how human activity has devastated certain species, such as salmon, in order to better our lives, and to what cost. For example, like building of a dam is so detrimental to salmon, to better our lives for power and everything like that, but at what cost to the salmon's life? So that's always something that I have with me in the back of my head. So despite being a part of the salmon people for my community, I've never actually harvested a salmon on our traditional territory. Of course, I've caught salmon with the field. I actually work in the field with salmon, but we always release them. So you can actually see a picture here. This is us acoustic tagging a study. So we've actually caught this king salmon or Chinook salmon and released it. So the decline of salmon. Today, very few people, like probably almost zero every year, are actually fishing along the Yukon River. Like I said, the banks were once lined with salmon and fish camps all the way up to Mitchie Creek and McClintock River, where the salmon actually spawn. And that's Mitchie and McClintock are the southern part of the river, so that's where the journey ends for the salmon. KDFN itself hasn't fished for over 20 years for salmon or anything. A lot of our elders, their diet consists of salmon and wild meat, but our salmon now is flown to us from Taku in the spirit of sharing. There's actually stories of kids seeing a plane come in and they know that's salmon. So they actually think that salmon can fly because once they see the plane, they know that salmon's coming. So that's it's a little sad to hear that. And of course, the decline of salmon, not only is it other factors, but the Whitehorse Dam was constructed in 1949, and the salmon were actually blocked at the bottom of the dam to get to their spawning ground, so they couldn't get by. So they decided to build a fish ladder, but by the time they built the ladder, the numbers had already drastically declined, and there was really nothing that they can do. And so for another example of the dam, we have escapement goals with the Pacific Salmon Treaty. So approximately 40 to 50,000 should be coming to the Yukon, and then approximately the average is about 1,000 that would go through the fish ladder. But in 2019, only about 200 and some salmon actually passed the dam, so that was pretty shocking last year. What are some factors that actually can affect salmon? Well, of course, with the climate action and everything, the biggest thing right now, I believe, well, two big things are the overfishing in Alaska and the warmer waters. The warmer waters causes stress to the salmon, and they actually can die from that. The overfishing, of course, is a big thing for them. The changing of migration routes, like the glaciers melting, rivers being redirected, stuff like that, that's actually huge. Obstructions, such as the Whitehorse Dam I was just talking about, but beaver dams are actually another obstruction. As you can see in the picture here, this is a KDFN land steward removing a beaver dam to ensure that the salmon can actually get through. Predation, like bears and that, and diseases. So there's like sea lice, and they can actually get, for example, in our tagging study, we actually caught a salmon last year, and I'm not sure what it had, but it had a huge bump on its shoulder, and I don't know if it was a disease or if it was a tumor, but yeah. So what are we in Kwalundun actually doing right now to for salmon restoration? So we're actually taking a very active role in implementing our final agreement. So some things that we are doing is like the Ibex Valley in-stream incubation, where we go out and catch a male and female salmon, take their eggs, fertilize them with the male's milk, and we actually plant them into a stream just like the salmon would. Mitchie Creek Chinook Salmon Monitoring Project, that's been going on for over 20 years. That's has to do with a lot of water temperatures, so looking at the fry, removing beaver dams, etc. We've actually just started a community-based salmon plan. That's just to meet with the community and talk about our goals and stuff like that. And we've assisted with the acoustic tagging study. This study is actually in partnership with Carleton and Carcross-Tagus First Nation. And basically what we're doing is we are capturing salmon, putting a tag into their bellies. Yes, I know that sounds weird. And then we take a little sample for DNA and all that, or genetics, and then we re-release them. And we do this in 2 rivers to see basically how many salmon are actually passing the Whitehorse Dam versus salmon that don't have to pass a dam. So you can see in the top figure here, figure 8, these are some eggs in one of our Ibex Valley study. And then here's another picture in figure 9 of actual Ibex Valley. So some advice that I have for planners to better engage and listen to Indigenous youth. I'll start off by saying I was one of these really quiet youth before I started school and everything, so I wasn't really engaged, but some things that help me and that I know that I see that helps others is just start by listening and talking to them and seeing what their views are. They actually do have a lot to say if you listen. It's really great once they start telling you about what what their ideas and everything is. Also include youth in decision making and include them in your planning. Like for example, our community salmon plan. I'm a youth that's on that plan, help create that plan with a bunch of other people, but I always think it's great to have a youth in that. And here are their ideas. Sometimes they got really good ideas, and sometimes maybe they don't feel heard and they don't want to tell their ideas to everybody, but yeah. I would go to youth groups, like for example, Boys and Girls Club. We have a lot of different youth groups up in the Yukon, so that's something that we've really found positive. Another one would be educating them on the issues. Sometimes they don't know what's going on. Like I said, for the longest time, I didn't know what was going on with the salmon until I finally, worked in the field and talked to people, and that was my writing, and then I wanted to go into that field. If possible, take them out on the land. That's where their ancestors once was, and maybe teachings from the elders, and that's a really good one to include. Create a safe space and open dialogue for youth. You don't want a space where they feel like if they say their ideas that they're going to either, be made fun of, or maybe somebody doesn't think their idea is good enough. So you want to create that safe space so they feel, safe, so that they'll be able to give you their ideas. And of course, last but not least, engage elders with youth. We're the next generation, and it's we have to take on from oral history from our elders, and we're the knowledge of their keeper, or the keepers of their knowledge. So it's up to us to pass down this knowledge from generation to generation. I wanted to end my presentation with a couple quotes from 2 elders and then a youth, just because I wanted to put in perspective of what it used to be like and what it kind of is now. So Elder Louis Smith is Kwalundun First Nation. This always gets to me. He said, "Our people would have starved long ago without the salmon. Now it's our turn to save them." Another two elders are Kitty Smith and Fred Smith. They said, I really miss it. I wish it was like a long time ago again. A lot of moose, a lot of fish, everything. And never see anything like that again. And then the youth perspective is actually from my friend Carissa Waugh. She said, when I was a young teenager, I remember being down at her fish camp. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce that. My papa Al had just pulled salmon out of the net in the Yukon River. Grandma started gutting the fish and filleting it for the smoke shack. Grandma always had a lot of teaching, such as how to make dream catchers, pick mushrooms, and so much more. I've always wanted my future children to have the same cultural opportunities as me. But with this major decline in salmon, there is a really good chance that they won't. I want to pass my culture and my grandma's teachings on to our future generations. And so just for example, with what Carissa said, fish camps, they used to catch hundreds of salmon and it would be still at a substantial numbers. Carissa's fish camp, they catch about 5 or 6, but I don't know the last time that they've actually had a fish camp. Yeah, so that is all I have. Thank you for listening to me and hearing what I have to say. Thank you for this opportunity. And yeah, and there's my email if you have any questions.
Hi, Cheyenne. Thank you so much for educating us on how important salmon is to you as a youth and the health of your community on many different levels, and for telling us about the important work that you are doing up in the Yukon. Here at PIBC, I have to tell you, we were so impressed that we would like to donate, make a small donation, $200 towards a charity of your choice that works in this area, maybe a youth organization. Do you have any suggestions at the top of your mind, or you can let me know later?
Yes, no, that would be awesome. Yeah, that's the thing with salmon. We're always looking for, a little help along the way. But I don't have anything in mind right now, but I will talk to people in my First Nation and possibly see.
That sounds great. We'll link up later. And I had a thought when you were talking about the children of your community thinking that salmon fly. I think this is perfect for a children's book. So just a thought. I think that would be
maybe
a great thing to write. Okay, thanks again, Cheyenne. Please, I will let you back on later on for the question period. And now I would like to introduce or invite Sarah Tasi-Baker from North Vancouver, BC, to turn on her webcam and her mic. Sarah is the lead Indigenous consultant with Sky Spirit Consulting and an Indigenous youth of Squamish, Musqueam, Pakwai, Kibak, Tlingit, Haida, and Hungarian background. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you so much. And thank you, Cheyenne. It was really lovely to hear your words. Great, thank you. Cheyenne, actually, we have very similar legends in our Squamish Nation territory. Our elders used to say that the rivers would be so full of salmon that you could walk across it and get from one side to the other just walking on the backs of the salmon. So we definitely feel the decline of the salmon very heavily in our community as well. Hotsquile, good day, and Kayetshten, for those of you in Vancouver or in Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh territory. Kayetshten means welcome to my territory, and my hands are up to you. Today I'll be presenting my work on decolonizing planning, architecture, landscape, and design, and I'm the lead Indigenous design consultant at Sky Spirit Consulting. I would kindly request that no photos, recordings, other than the live stream that is being recorded, screenshots or detailed notes be taken during my presentation, as per our oral history tradition. I invite you to absorb what you feel drawn to, and don't feel pressured to memorize everything I'm telling you, because there's a lot of information here. And just to introduce myself in our traditional way, my Kwakwala ancestral name is Gesuguelak, which means creator or creative one. I'm a descendant of many powerful matriarchs and incredible chieftains, and I'm a descendant of my late grandmother, Chief Emily Nelson Baker, and I have a family practice with my parents, Mary Tasi and Wade Baker. And what I'm going to be talking about today is these three main points I wanted to talk to when I was considering putting together this presentation. I was really considering what is the role of a planner and what is the role of a planner today. And I was thinking about how it's really important to understand that as planners or developers, that you have a colonial role, especially in unceded British Columbia territory. And you are actively, potentially, and unknowingly continuing colonization. So how can we decolonize our thinking and start rooting ourselves in the territories? So I wanted to talk about moving away from pan-indigeneity, which Sarah spoke to a bit earlier, as well as addressing the three fears, which is something I developed in my master's program, and then discussing co-creation over consultation. So our company, Sky Spirit Consulting, is a family practice in Coast Salish territory, and it's the amalgamation of over 20 years of work with Sky Spirit Studio. It's the distillation of innovative work that myself, my mother, and my father have done and worked together through our education and our past projects. This is our team. So my mother, Mary Tasi, is the Hungarian side, and she's also a member of your lovely institution and is an urban planner, so she's on this call. Hi, Mom. And then Wade Baker is myself and my father are Squamish Nation, and he's an incredible master carver, oral historian, and cultural consultant. So it's pretty fun. We've been all quarantining together and working together and actually having a really great workflow. So that's been really fun to be around my parents this much during these COVID times. Our process at our studio focuses on combining Indigenous design and research methodologies with oral history, primary archival research, alongside ancestral Coast Salish protocols and coastal protocols. And our goal is to develop meaningful action plans for reconciliation through design. And we root our work in the principles of two-eyed seeing, which is a concept developed by a Mi'kmaq elder discussing the ability to translate and straddle both worlds of Western ideology and Indigenous ways of knowing. And we also ensure that we have a trauma-informed lens, specifically because Indigenous people have accumulatively experienced so much trauma through colonization. It's very important to understand how those traumas can be enforced through planning and design, or healed and transformed through planning and design. So to discuss my first point that I really want to get across is moving away from pan-indigeneity. For those that don't know what pan-indigenous thinking is, it is attributed to the thinking that all Indigenous people share common needs, cultural practices, languages, beliefs, and so on. And originally, pan-indigeneity came out of a really positive concept of solidarity across the nations. However, now we're experiencing that pan-indigeneity can create a sense of homogeneity, which is counterintuitive to reconciliatory practices and processes. This is a map from native-land.ca. For any notes that you will take, I recommend writing this one down. www.native-land.ca is an excellent resource to begin your journey of understanding whose territory you're on. And this is essentially a map of BC, and we don't normally see this. This is all the traditional territories. You can see how much they overlap and how complex, and how each and every one of these zones is a different cultural, has a different cultural practice, different nationhood, different governing systems. And BC in particular is so rich, you can see the overlapping complexities of this territory. And just keeping this image in mind, we don't normally see images like this. We normally see the linear lines drawn by the original map makers in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s. And this is what our territories look like. And because it's unceded, this is what they still look like. And how can we ensure that through design that these territories are celebrated? So what to do? Know whose land you're on. Sarah spoke to this a bit earlier. Understand that our cultures, languages, territories, family practices, governance, and governing systems are all unique and distinct. And understand that there are complexities within our governing systems. There's major differences between band governance, hereditary governance, self-governance, so on and so forth, and also combinations of all of those and more. So understanding the complexity of the area that you're designing on and the sites that you're designing on is incredibly important, especially when designing on what is currently known as British Columbia, which is on and within unceded territory. And for those that don't know, unceded means never given up and never ceded over. So there are no written legal documents, no signing over of this land. There was no war. Like, this land is, for all intents and purposes, still ours. However, we're experiencing colonization through the erasure of our voices being involved in the planning processes. What else can we do? Be specific. What's been incredible has been we've been moving away from using the word Indian towards Aboriginal, and now we're using the word Indigenous to describe our peoples. And what I would encourage you and challenge you to continue doing is becoming more and more specific. Which specific nations are you referring to? Are you working with an Indigenous design consultant, or are you working with a Squamish, Musqueam, Kwakwaka'wakw, Misquemanzang, Saladino, Tlingit, and part Hungarian Indigenous design consultant? How specific can you be? And starting to learn the language of all the different nations around you will help you relate to our nations, and our nations relate to you. And as I said, being specific is an incredible journey. It takes a lot of research, a lot of time, and a lot of ability to understand history that we haven't been taught. This is a map of my own identity. Having my master's in sustainable urban planning and my undergrad in architecture and environmental design, I thought I might as well map it. So this is me trying to understand my own complexity. And you can see how I'm essentially related to the whole West Coast. So on my Tlingit side, through Chief Shakes, on my Haida side, Chief Nankoot through the Tlingit, Chief Emily Nelson-Baker, moving all the way down into Squamish and Musqueam territory with Chief Kiapalana, different than Chief Joe Capilano, who Sarah mentioned earlier, although I'm related to both, and then Chief Daniel Baker, my grandfather, on my Musqueam Squamish side. So learning how to be incredibly detailed and specific is so important to understanding the true stories and true narratives of the spaces that you are designing and planning in. So my family has lived here on the west coast of what is currently known as Canada for over 809 generations. Now think of that number, over 809 generations. That's approximately 16,000 plus years that we've been in this territory. But if you consider how geography changes over time, that could be much closer to over 80,000 years. And we would prefer to simply just say my family has been here since time immemorial. Now consider how much identity is written into space when you're in a territory for so long. Often in planning, we're trying to seek the identity of a place or how to exude the character of a place. When you're in unceded territory, there already is an identity. There already is a spirit of place. There already is a character there. And it's about how, through protocol and through respectful action, can you understand how to relate to the identity of our places and our territories. For example, this is a map of the Squamish Nation territory. And please remember that this is overlapping with Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh territories as well, and a lot of our territory is shared. And then you can see here all of the 28 major village names in our territory. And every single one of those village names comes with a story and is hosted by a certain family. So when you start becoming specific about what nations you're working with, you can then start becoming specific about the families and the village names that you're working with. And then you can start realizing that every single one of these village names hosts and holds oral history and memory, which you can actually celebrate through the design of spaces. For example, Khoi Khoi, which is the longhouse you see that I rendered here from Chief August Jack's sketches, was a traditional longhouse in what is currently known as Stanley Park. And it was an incredible place of gathering. There are so many stories around this area that ideally, if we're able to rebuild this longhouse, which was taken down, how incredible it would be to tap into that incredibly rich oral history and narrative to start designing and putting back our ancestral and cultural revitalization into the planning of Vancouver. And what I'm essentially getting at is design and sovereignty. Work with us as sovereign people, regardless of how unique and different all of our governing systems are. Recognizing and respecting the thousands and thousands of generations of land stewardship and the thousands of generations of oral history and passed on knowledge, you can actually benefit planning in significant and precedent-setting ways that have never been done before in Western memory since colonization and the continued colonization of our territories. So what I want to get into in terms of how do we logistically start doing that, it starts with yourself. It starts with understanding how Western institutions teach us to interact with the world around us and that by addressing the 3 fears, which is a concept I developed in my master's studies, especially after reading Harold Cardinal's The Unjust Society, which was a response to Pierre Trudeau's white paper, and his response to refusing assimilation. There was a concept that Harold Cardinal used, which he said, there are these buckskin curtains, which essentially represents these barriers of translation between Western thought and Indigenous ways of knowing, and that our cultures are so different, developing completely separately from each other, that it's very difficult to translate across our cultures, especially translating from the Western culture, because it can cause harm. So I looked into this and I thought, well, what is it that we're really experiencing when we come up against blocks around working together and consulting together, and how do these harms come about? So what I did with my mother, hi Mom, was we looked at the entirety of colonial history and traced it back to 1400 AD. And we started uncovering these themes of how colonization has, hey Mom, has iterated itself throughout history and then into design and planning. So these 3 fears are fear of the wild, fear of the unknown, and fear of dispossession. Fear of the wild, we found, has affected design, the design of spaces, as well as policy. Fear of the unknown affects consulting and the engagement process and dialogue. And the fear of dispossession in particular affects authentic dialogue. So I'll get into each of these, and please, this is a very short presentation on very complex concepts. So if you're interested in more in-depth research and journeying into this, please don't hesitate to contact us about our workshops. I wanted to quickly mention as well that fear of the wild essentially translates to fear of dehumanization. And Indigenous people, we have been dehumanized throughout history. Fear of the unknown is the fear of transformation. We've been effectively blocked by the traumas that we're experiencing from colonization, which stunts our growth and our ability to transform and heal, which are incredibly integral parts of our culture. And then fear of dispossession is fear of displacement. Majority of Indigenous people have been displaced from our territories or displaced through lack of food sovereignty or lack of traditional resources. And what's intriguing is that these fears have affected Indigenous people incredibly negatively, but these are fears that the Western world holds. So if we can undo these fears, we can start lifting the pressure off of Indigenous people so that we can, in a good way, begin this incredible process and journey. So I'll quickly discuss each of these fears and then get into my last point. So fear of the wild is this intrinsic understanding that the dark and scary woods are an unsafe place. You think of the wild woman, you think of the boogeyman, tales that your parents would tell you of the scary dark woods in the night. And what's interesting is moving from that original fear, that inciting fear, you can actually see this iterated throughout design all across the world. In 1908, Adolf Loos, an Austrian architect, wrote a book called Ornament and Crime. And in this book, he likened ornamentation to be criminal. And then he used the image of Papua New Guinea women, Indigenous women, and their tattooing practices, and criminalized the practice of ornamentation, or what he called ornamentation, and to us is incredibly much more significant than just ornamentation. Adolf Loos also likened this practice to savagery and to barbaric practices, so a dehumanization. Also, Hungarian folk culture was not without this, and he also disagreed with the ornamentation of Eastern European folk cultures. And he disliked ornamented plates and columns and nice shoes. But what he did like, and he described as being the perfection and the epitome of good design, was a cigarette box. And Adolf Loos was considered the father of modernism. And so after reading this book, I became highly critical of clean, sanitary, white wall spaces that we often glorify in good modern design. And what's also interesting is how fear of the wild has been exhibited most prominently through landscape and the landscape movements throughout the centuries. So, for example, Versailles, King Louis XV. Mom, am I right? In Versailles in particular, you can see that for King Louis, it was really important to him to show mastery over nature. And in order to show that, you create mastery over nature through incredible feats of waterworks and extreme symmetry and extremely controlled nature. And this later moved into picturesque movements, into British landscaping, and eventually into its worst form, arguably, the American lawn. And all of these practices result in highly unsustainable relationships to land and the environment that are iterated throughout design and are still upheld and celebrated through majority of park design. And we end up with these cigarette box buildings and these cigarette box spaces, such as Adolf Loos's Villa Moller. And when you start celebrating these inherently racist ideologies that came out of dehumanizing Indigenous people and being afraid of the wild or the wilderness and likening Indigenous people to the wild as savage and uncivilized, and westernization, or essentially whiteness, being considered as civilization, how this operates in planning is you end up with colonial practices such as redlining, gentrification, erasure of Indigenous voices and story of place, discriminatory policies that affect Black and Indigenous people and people of color. And you end up with assimilatory cities where it's very difficult to practice culture, and unsafe spaces. From the Western perspective, this is an unfortunate circumstance. To Indigenous and Black people and people of color, this really reflects our lives. Lives are lost in cities that are not designed for us. So, how do we move through fear of the wild? I invite you to start building a relationship with the wild, and I invite you into my territory. And what an incredible feat if you start involving Indigenous youth in the design process. I'm 24 years old, and I've started this planning and design process 2 years ago, officially with my parents. And what an incredible opportunity from an Indigenous perspective, how to design spaces. And what I've noticed is that our spaces really focus on providence, providing for your people, providing for the people on the land, wealth. In my culture, the more you give, the richer you are, and generosity. So how you design spaces that ensure that you are provided for, that you feel wealthy and prosperous, and where you feel like you are so wealthy and prosperous, you can also be generous and safe and joyous in the places that you live. And this, for example, is a forageable commons that I designed in my undergrad. And wouldn't it be incredible to start building capacity for more Indigenous youth to be in planning practices, architectural practices? What can you do as a planner to train Indigenous youth in these abilities in order to start actually saying what we want? Instead of just always being asked what we want, can we actually put pen to paper and start showing you what we want on our own territory, which is inherently decolonial in practice? And what's incredible is that this can create stunning cities. For example, this is a gateway to ancient wisdom that my father did on the Spirit Trail in Coast Salish style in our own Squamish Nation territory. This is Susan Point's Musqueam Spindle Whorl at YVR. So as you get off the plane, this is what you see coming into Musqueam territory by the airport. And then Deborah Sparrow's Blanketing the City project, where finally the city is reflecting who we are as a people. And this is just the beginning. The second fear I wanted to talk about was fear of the unknown. Here I have the dreaded timeline, the dreaded project timeline, and this is not even as complicated as I'm sure all of you know it can get in planning. And the reason I put this up is because Western concepts of timelines, deliverables, ticking the boxes are inherently colonial and can be very harmful when involving Indigenous peoples in these processes and projects. A very severe timeline that isn't reflective of Indigenous cultural practices and values not only easily, but will inherently tokenize the Indigenous people you're working with. You're ticking a box. Did we include an Indigenous person? If you're just doing a check, then you're not doing it right. Insincere engagement, which results in very real harm to the communities. As a planner, you can go away from the consultation process and not be affected by the consultation process and simply be excited about a job well done. Whereas these communities live with the very legitimate harm caused by these colonial practices. And they can also be very patronizing. Please remember that we've been here for time immemorial. We have wisdom. We have incredible wisdom that I think is very valuable to understanding what we'd like to see in our own territories. So instead, let's rethink. How can we undergo these processes in a good way with a good heart? And what we do here at Sky Spirit Consulting is we ensure that we follow Coast Salish ancestral protocols in order to lead Indigenous community engagement. So there's a lot of talking, incredible amounts of talking. You're relating to yourself, the people around you, ensuring that there is relationship building that is reciprocal, which is key. If you're having an extractive relationship, that is still colonial. If it is reciprocal, if not additive, then you are working in a decolonial lens. And like I said, we teach large-scale workshops that can go much more in-depth into these processes. But the main point here is make sure that Indigenous people are leading, and how can you ensure that you can build capacity so Indigenous people are leading, so their own voices are heard in the right context and the right way. And then the third fear is fear of dispossession. If we truly have a reconciliatory conversation, what does that mean about the land that we are on, considering this is unceded territory? Does that mean, as a settler, you have to move? That stops the conversation. That fear of dispossession stops the conversation from moving forward in a good way, in a creative way. And I think that fear is making it very difficult to do the decolonial work that needs to be done. When actually, if we truly pursue this, it can be an incredibly enriching project. So for example, this is the new Sanok development being proposed by the Squamish Nation. This is one of the first situations where the city of Vancouver gave back land to the Squamish Nation. And now the Squamish Nation is building this incredibly ambitious and beautiful project on Sanok, which will house thousands of people during a housing crisis. This isn't scary, this is exciting. Giving back the territory to the original people can be an incredibly enriching, healthy process where a lot of people can benefit in multidimensional ways. And I also have here a photo of Shakimiya Siam, Chief Janice George, who is the ancestral chieftain and holds the ancestral chieftainship of Sanok and of that territory. And how amazing is it to be able to speak to the ancestral chieftainship and ask them what they would like to see in their territory and how they would like to provide for the people around them. And as I said, in my culture, the more you give, the richer you are. How wealthy and prosperous this is. And then my last point is I would like to discuss co-creation over consultation. And how do I want to start? So co-creation over consultation. Indigenous people are often consulted, but that often doesn't actually show up in the design process at the end of the day. And I'm on this incredible group chat on Instagram with several different Indigenous architects and planners from all over the world. And there's not that many of us, but it's just really excited we started this group chat. And then Let Ku, who's Interior Salish, asked the group, what do people get wrong about Indigenous architecture? So Khel Salem from the Squamish Nation said that building designs that adopt an Indigenous typology in an aesthetic, but not an internal program, is problematic. And then Beau DeBell, who is a Gamilaraay, Australian Indigenous architect, said that Indigenous architecture should not need to have a certain aesthetic to qualify. It doesn't need to be about mud, reeds, wood, and so on. It is about the Indigenous use and spirit of place that is the most important. And BSI Studio from the States, they said, they don't ask the right questions, nor do enough research when working with Indigenous people. And then they impose their Eurocentric Beau Arts, ego-driven design methodology onto a group of folks who may feel intimidated or overwhelmed by that person or group. For example, academic language or overly architectural planning jargon language can be very overwhelming. And then the design becomes a caricature or misrepresentation, a failed attempt to breathe life into a design that could have been so rich and meaningful otherwise. And this is an example of one of their projects for Traditional Living Center for At-Risk Youth in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And more importantly, BSI Studio said, lol, maybe I should have said what people get wrong is that no one brings good homemade food to meetings anymore and it kills the creativity, which is very true. And if you're going to note anything down, maybe note that down. And then BSI Studio continued to say, it is about the story of place. It is about the story of the people as given to the designer during stakeholder meetings. The people have the right to define themselves in real time. That dialogue creates the foundation for responsive design that makes people happy when they see it and experience it, because it represents their story. And this is a Pawnee Nation dance arbor that they designed in Oklahoma. So Chenkwemen Tomiak, thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you for listening to my presentation. As I said, I hope you absorbed what I'm talking about and speaking about, and I hope you see the beauty in the movement that is happening right now in Indigenous planning, architecture, and design. And I really hope you're inspired to position yourself in this movement and see where you can help to think with a decolonial lens and uplift, amplify, and work with different Indigenous people and intersectional Indigenous people, as well as different people of color, such as in the Black communities, and so on, in order to ensure that when we are designing as planners, we are designing to ensure that we are not designing the status quo, and we are working towards something better. So Chenkwemen Tomiak, thank you so much for listening to my presentation.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for presenting on decolonizing planning, a topic that has an indirect impact not only on climate action, the environment, but basically every other initiatives that planners are involved with. I heard a quote that goes like this: wisdom is knowledge in practice. So I would like to say you are a very, very wise woman. Thank you. At this time, I would like to invite both Sarah and Cheyenne back on camera.
Thank you.
Hello. So I see that we don't have any questions. I think people are trying to process all this information today. I know I am. I've learned a lot, and I hope our viewers have learned a lot too. This is only the beginning. I know you ladies will go on to do amazing things, and I'm very happy to have met all of you. You too, Sarah, for assisting in the reconciliation process. I think that youth is very important. They're our future, and I'm very happy that both you and Sierra and Cheyenne were able to participate today. I would like to say Chenkwemen Tomi to Sierra and Nasi Cho to Cheyenne for joining us today. Cheyenne, actually, we hope to see you next year in 2021 in the Yukon, as PIBC will be holding its annual conference at that time, if all goes well. And our host venue is actually the Kwanladan Cultural Center. So I hope to see you, Cheyenne, there, and everybody, Sierra, Sarah. It would be a nice reunion. So thank you again. You too, Sarah. We will be sending out the link to the webinar recording to everybody who has registered today, as well as this presentation will be going on to our PIBC YouTube channel. And I know CIP is also very interested in the presentation, and they will be promoting it on a national scale as well, which is fantastic, and we appreciate their support. I'd like to thank the Real Estate Foundation once again for supporting and sponsoring this webinar, which allowed us to present it for free to our members and to the general public. We have one more webinar coming up in this spring-summer season. Webinar number 7 will be looking at affordable housing, integrated design, and high-performance new construction. And one of the case studies will actually be of a housing project up in the Yukon. So that might be an interesting thing for you, Shan, if you want to watch it. So thank you again on behalf of PIBC to all the participants and to our speakers. I appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us. Would anybody like to say anything before we go? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. This webinar is now done, and everybody have a wonderful day. Oh, someone is typing. Let's
Thank you
see.
very much.
Okay. Yeah, I agree, Dawn. Very, very inspiring. Thank you for your comment. I appreciate it. Bye for now.